At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Drug Science Podcast. It's me, Hannah Thurger, and Jo Neal hosting the podcast today. We have a fantastic guest lined up. It's the man behind Psychedelic Alpha, Josh Hardman. Since meeting him a few months ago, I wanted to get him locked into an episode to explore his insights into the psychedelic sector and the ever-changing landscape, especially the areas of recent policy reform. Josh is the founder and editor of Psychedelic Alpha, so for those of you who don't know, it's a completely free web resource and newsletter with various data sets and trackers available on the website. He provides well-researched, informed updates, which I genuinely look forward to reading. Prior to this, Josh studied social sciences with focus on politics and social movements at the London School of Economics and UC Berkeley. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Jo. Great to be here.
Hey, welcome.
Great. Really looking forward to picking your brains. So I thought we could kick off with just a bit of the story behind Psychedelic Alpha, which used to be called Psilocybin Alpha, and why you decided to start the newsletter and resource.
Yeah, for sure. I'll try and keep it quick, but the interest goes back quite a long way. So I grew up in Suffolk in the countryside, probably the least psychedelic place you could imagine, and started studying at LSE, which is quite, in my opinion, kind of quite a corporate focused university, at least when I was there. You know, most of my classmates ended up in consultancy and finance, but I had a real interest in social movements from like a sociological, anthropological perspective. So I ended up at UC Berkeley in my third year. My advisor kind of encouraged me to go and get out of my system and go to Berkeley, which obviously is known for being quite liberal and obviously has roots in the hippie movement in the 60s. So I went out there and spent most of the year interviewing hippies, Black Panthers, mathematicians who were unwittingly involved in creating the atomic bomb. So all of these kind of interesting people who had been lost to the Tim Learys of history, right? You know, they hadn't been focused on because they weren't the celebrities of the 60s. So I think, you know, speaking to a lot of those groups, obviously I came across the kind of historical role of psychedelics and the counterculture and, you know, became interested in that sense. But it wasn't until I came back to the UK and started working in kind of social policy and economic policy that I came across this kind of biotech side of the psychedelic renaissance. So I had only seen the kind of indigenous, hippie and raver kind of context of psychedelics. I hadn't seen this new kind of, you know, people who look more like me with, you know, glasses and, you know, looked a bit more square becoming interested in psychedelics. And to be honest, I mean, my initial reaction, this is in maybe 2019, 2020, my initial reaction was one of fear. I was kind of like, you know, we're going to medicalize or kind of, you know, big pharma is going to ruin the one thing we have left to enjoy and that we have left to kind of escape this kind of almost late stage capitalist system that we're in. So I think at that time I was thinking about it, you know, very counterculturally and was, you know, very scared. But then the thing that actually got me interested and ironically led to me, you know, starting a website about investing in psychedelics and working for an investment fund was thinking about, you know, the potential benefits of having a medical model of psychedelics as well, which is, in my opinion, the biggest benefit is reimbursement. So I was thinking back to, you know, where I grew up in Suffolk. I think most of the people I grew up with and my family would only ever consider a psychedelic therapy if it was recommended by their GP, you know, provided by the NHS, just for, you know, cultural reasons, but also cost reasons. So that's why I became interested. I started Psilocybin Alpha in 2020, very early 2020. And initially it was a one-page website listing the companies involved in this and the research, and kind of started explaining to readers, you know, took them on my journey of learning about how drug development worked, you know, what was the point of it, And very quickly realized, this wasn't anything, like cannabis that we'd seen before in terms of the commercial side. It wasn't kind of an economy of scale. It was really, classic drug development with added hurdles, such as, the pairing with therapy, the difficulty of securing patents. So yeah, I just kind of began writing about all of these things and began meeting people like Graham Pachenik, who explained patents to me, my friend Michael Heiken, who explained drug development and pharmaceuticals. So yeah, I've just been on this journey over the last 3 years and trying to share what I've learned with readers. And as you alluded to, that journey began really with focusing on psilocybin, but now has broadened to all psychedelics. It quickly became apparent that psilocybin was just, one molecule. And then, the other thing to note is the word alpha was originally referring to investment, right? Alpha meaning returns above, standard returns in the investment world. But, quite quickly within, a year, I tried to redefine that as, not just a return on financial investment, but also the return on, people who have invested their careers in this, like you two who are working on the research side, people who have invested, energy and risk, right? People have risked a lot. And then also thinking about those returns, not just economically, but societally, and potentially, pushing the boundaries on how we, develop drugs, but also how we pay for them and how we recognize value in them. So I think I've really tried to broaden beyond psilocybin and beyond, a financial understanding of return. So yeah, that's where we're at. And I think you did a great job of explaining, what we try and do today, which is provide, as much data and analysis as we can for free, whilst also, we have some small consultancy side to the business to, keep ourselves solvent. But yeah, a big part of the mission is providing that information for free.
Josh, it is a phenomenal effort on your part. It's incredible, Psychedelic Alpha. There's so much information and it comes out, it's every week, isn't it?
I mean, it was every week for a while. Now it's kind of gone fortnightly. And the reason is because someone actually emailed and said, I can tell that some weeks you're struggling for things to write about. So I didn't know whether that was a compliment or a detraction. So I decided to just wait until there was enough to write about. But then you get these ridiculously long bulletins like we published the other week, which someone emailed me and said it took an hour for them to get through it all. So yeah, we publish every couple of weeks.
It must take a lot longer to prepare it, though. It's a huge commitment.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like a huge commitment, and other times it feels like, a joy to be able to publish it and reach, 20,000 people or whatever. I think it's exciting in that sense. Yeah. But yeah, sometimes it feels like a chore, but most of the time it feels like a joy.
And just how long do you spend reading on the different areas to contribute to the bulletin? Yeah,
I mean, I did a podcast with Greg and Matthias at SciMed Ventures, who had the Business Trip podcast. And I jokingly said, they said, how long a day do you spend reading? And I jokingly said, 7 hours and 36 minutes, some fun and like comically specific number. But seriously, I think maybe 6 hours a day I spend reading. So the first thing I do in the morning, I have this scraper that shows me everything that's been published in the literature, but also, in popular media. And I go through it and just like mark stuff that I want to read. And then I just skim it. I don't have time to go deep into everything. But I think that's why it is a joy really and a pleasure, because, folks like yourself are working, deeply on specific topics and you're subject matter experts in your specific fields, right? Whereas, my job is really to kind of zoom out and try and hover above it all and understand all of it, which is, a task, but also a joy to be able to just digest the work that true experts are doing. So yeah, I mean, it takes a long time to read the information, and particularly it takes a long time for me to understand it. I don't have a science background, but yeah, so I spend maybe 6 hours a day just reading. Yeah.
And do you get a lot of feedback? People give you really good, helpful feedback on it?
Yeah, I mean, we have a Slack channel that I use with Graham Pachenik and Michael and our friends there, and my colleague Noah, and we discuss, papers as they get published. Every patent that gets issued or published, we discuss. So, I gain a lot of my insights from this like hive mind, and my friend Mario helps me understand psychopharmacology. So yeah, I really actually just rely on other people to help me understand things. And then in terms of reader feedback, in the early days, it was just kind of sending a newsletter out into the ether and never really hearing back. But then I was quite conscious to kind of tell readers, if you enjoyed this, please reply, or like, if you made it this far, reply. And I think anyone else out there who has a newsletter or who is like creating or publishing anything, I would really advise to do that. I mean, it's probably off topic for this podcast, but yeah, just remind your readers or listeners that they can reach out to you. You're not it's not a one-way flow of information. And I think since I did that, it became a lot more interesting because you do get, pushback, and we've published, some articles and investigations that have been a bit more kind of controversial. So it's caused some conversation. I think that's the most enjoyable part for me, that kind of like Socratic method, right, of debate and discussion. So, yeah.
Well, Joe, we always encourage our listeners to reach out to us and suggest potential guests for future episodes as well, and to get in touch and to see how they're enjoying our episodes, or there's other areas they'd like to be explored further.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. It's so important to get feedback. So that's a good shout out to all our listeners to feedback if you do get Psychedelic Alpha, and to feedback to us about the podcast.
And so you can tell from the newsletter and from the website just how broad your understanding is. You say you don't have a scientific understanding, but you bring in all your different perspectives, including obviously your experience at LSE and Berkeley. So really now thinking about the psychedelic so-called industry and that sector, it'd be great to have a bit of a history on it and how you've seen it change. Obviously, that's reflected in the name change from psilocybin alpha to psychedelic alpha. But what are some of the other kind of key milestones you've seen over the past couple of years, starting from that boom and before the boom?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I mean, obviously the psychedelic renaissance was founded in, research, right, as early as the 90s, like Rick Strassman's early DMT research, and then some of, Griffith's work on psilocybin with end-of-life patients. But, I think now the psychedelic renaissance has become, we think about it as stuff that's happened just in the past decade, right, which has been largely characterized by commercial stuff. So yeah, I think, obviously MAPS now has MAPS PBC, which is a for-profit entity, but almost all of their drug development's been non-profit. But really, since I started writing about the space, it has been, dominated the drug development by for-profits. So I think that's like a really interesting shift in itself. And it also has implications for the type of work that gets funded. So yeah, so since I started writing in 2020, most of the funding in the space has gone to drug development or sponsored research related to drug development. So the industry really, you can think of this value chain that has all different sorts of things from, manufacturing the API or the drug product itself, through to the drug development and discovery, all the way through to clinics and care delivery. But really, the only thing that's been funded at the moment is drug development to a large extent. So I think, that's interesting in itself. It says something about where we are. We haven't got a single approved psychedelic yet, but all of this kind of exuberance and activity that emerged in 2020 with companies listing publicly, a lot of hype, a lot of the pitch decks that I was looking at the time when I worked for a VC fund in psychedelics, it was basically just, very basic. It was saying, we've discovered this new category of molecules, which we filed a patent on, we're raising and we're going to go after any of these indications. So it was a very kind of basic approach, but because there was so much hype and money flowing into the space from other sectors like, crypto and cannabis especially, there wasn't a great amount of like biotech bench strength on some of these funds. They were kind of just investing on the hype. So yeah, I mean, it was incredibly frothy. There was a couple of billion invested in 2020 and 2021. But then I think it became quite clear, both with the kind of like macroeconomic difficulties in the market and also in biotech. But I think it became quite clear that a lot of these companies, were overvalued. So now in this past year, we've seen valuations of these public companies and private companies come crashing down as the realities of, as you two both know, the realities of, identifying new drugs that are good clinical candidates, but also, validating them in trials is a huge task, right? And an expensive task. So it's been a difficult last year for the companies in the space. It's been a bit of a reckoning. And yeah, now it's, very difficult for companies to raise follow-on funding. So a lot of companies have gone out of business. But obviously, there are some positive catalysts, hopefully in the future, like around the time that this podcast goes out, MAPS, PBC's second phase 3 of MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD will hopefully be published. And, we're hoping for some good data there. But I really think, until there's evidence that payers like health insurers and, national health systems are willing to pay for these therapies, I think it is going to be difficult to attract, larger institutional investment until that is proven out. I don't think it's necessarily approval that's the issue now, it's reimbursement. So yeah, I mean, that's a messy way to chart the course of the industry. But yeah, I think hype and then, a bit of a bubble bursting is probably like the most high level sketch of what's happened in the past few years.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to follow it, hasn't it, Hannah? to see companies come and go. And the amount of money that's been invested seems huge.
Yeah, I mean, billions, which is phenomenal when you think of, groups, like Rick at MAPS who have been fundraising since, 1986 when it was founded. And then, within a few years, the amount of money that's poured into the space has absolutely eclipsed, the 150 million or so that they've raised over the last 40 years. So.
Yeah. It's just been extraordinary. So in terms of, regulatory approval, you see that coming as something relatively straightforward, but then the issues will be around reimbursement. Can you just explain to us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So if we just use the example of MDMA therapy, I guess, because it's, potentially going to be the first to be approved next year, perhaps. So I think it's just, a situation where compared to the standard of care, it's going to be very expensive, right? Because at the moment, the standard of care for most, mental health or psychiatric disorders is obviously take-home medications with some, perhaps talk therapy. But obviously MDMA therapy, given there's going to be such a large therapy element, right? Like psychotherapy element with maybe, 40 hours of therapy, the basic math of just multiplying the hourly rate of a therapist in the US, particularly, which is very high, which is good because, therapists should be remunerated well for their work, but it's a high rate. And then when you multiply that by the number of hours, you end up with kind of an immovable cost before you have, the cost of the drug, which obviously MAPS PBC wants to have a markup on to recoup their costs and reinvest them in all of their amazing social projects. Even before you take into account that drug markup, you have this huge immovable cost of the therapy time. So it's looking about, $10,000, $20,000 for MDMA therapy, which just blows out of the water, anything like standard of care. And the issue that I see is the social costs of conditions like PTSD and depression are obviously enormous, right? Things like productivity, isolation, and other things like that are the main costs of things like PTSD. But most healthcare assessors and insurance don't take into account societal costs. They only take into account direct healthcare costs. And actually, Joe, I think you co-authored something recently on psilocybin cost effectiveness, and I think a similar issue was found, right? Where in a healthcare perspective, it doesn't make sense, whereas in a societal perspective, it does. So I think these are the bigger kind of campaign points or policy points that we should all be advocating for, right? For, for example, NICE in the UK to be taking more of a social perspective of medicines and benefits. So I think, that's one thing, but I do think, there are ways that, this could be cost effective. Maybe it's better selecting patients. Maybe it's things like group therapy. And I do think that, in certain conditions, this will just be very obviously cost effective. But in terms of broadening out to, depression, second line treatment of depression, it's just like a hard sell at the moment to insurance companies. So I think, this is probably going to be the biggest issue. Obviously, sponsors like MAPS and Compass, are working very hard to understand the cost basis and, make that case to payers. But yeah, everyone I speak to kind of in the payer landscape, they kind of balking at the price for now, at least.
Yeah, so that's the two big questions in terms of scalability, the therapist time. I guess that's why you have different approaches. You have MAPS, which is quite heavy on the psychotherapy, and then you have Compass, where it's psychological support. And so some people argue that this is more to do with how these therapies are going to be scaled up. But how do we get payers to take that more holistic approach to seeing the value of these medicines?
Yeah, I think, some of it is just advocating and, putting psychedelics aside. And, in a way, what MAPS have done, right, they've kind of put MDMA aside, MAPS, the nonprofit, and just tried to advocate for drug policy reform more broadly. I think on the commercial side, it's, putting psychedelics aside and just advocating for this societal perspective more broadly. And maybe, once that perspective is embraced, it's not just psychedelic therapies that might make sense. It's other pretty basic, obvious interventions, that are in the social realm as opposed to like the pharmacological realm that would help with mental health. So I think these are just broader, campaigning and policy points that I think we should all embrace. But I do think, you mentioned MAPS and Compass having, different kind of assisted therapy protocols or psychological support. I think there is something to be said on the molecule side, right? I mean, MDMA is an pathogen, so it encourages people to open up, and that lends itself to talk therapy. Whereas I guess psilocybin, you wear the eye shade and you sort of go internally and introspect. So I think there's something to be said there. But I mean, it is obvious, Compass, what they're trying to do here. I mean, and it's pretty unsurprising, and you can't blame them. I mean, they're trying to obviously demonstrate the pharmacological effect of COMP360, their psilocybin, as much as possible, right? Because FDA doesn't regulate therapy. It's just a lot cleaner if you can just demonstrate the drugs doing the work, and potentially, psychological support. The type of healthcare professional that can deliver that might look different to the sort of healthcare professional that can deliver MAPS's manualized therapy, which is incredibly broad and has a lot of latitude around what you can do in the session. So yeah, I think, there's interesting things there. And obviously Compass has been, very forthright in trying to say, this isn't therapy, it is psychological support. They put out an opinion piece a couple of weeks ago and made a lot of fanfare about it, saying we shouldn't even call it psychedelic therapy. It should just be called psychedelic treatment or psilocybin treatment. I think the other thing, beyond trying to convince payers to think about things differently, the other thing is obviously to modify the intervention. So things like group therapy, or, as we're seeing at the moment, shorter trips, right? So things like DMT, 5-MeO, that's huge at the moment. And on the investment side, shorter trips and so-called non-hallucinogenic psychedelics are basically the only subject of new investor interest at the moment, because there is just this awareness that it is going to be a lot easier to integrate it into the existing model. And particularly with non-hallucinogenic psychedelics, there's nothing really disruptive about it at all, really. I mean, it's just a take-home medicine. And whether a non-hallucinogenic psychedelic, these so-called psychoplastogens, could still benefit from being administered alongside talk therapy is yet to be proven. But all of the early trials, I mean, presumably are just going to use it as like a standalone pharmacotherapy. And then, people like David Yaden and Ronan Griffiths have balked at this, right, and said, the whole point is the experience, and ethically, if we do prove that a psychoplastogen works, that's why I'm also an advocate for decrim and legalization, because ethically you could get to a situation where psychoplastogens are approved, and then, all of the kind of reform on the true psychedelic side just shuts down, because it's like, well, the government can say, we don't need a psychedelic. It's been proven. Yeah. So I think you need to carve out spaces for both. So yeah.
For sure, there will be patients possibly where a psychoplastogen is enough. But for many people, it's very hard to imagine that, a non-psychedelic experience will be enough to help them take them.
And maybe in different conditions where these psychoplastogens could potentially help, focusing more on different types of conditions that aren't so psychiatric. Something else to kind of consider, maybe to kind of not confuse the two as well, thinking kind of in a more broader perspective.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. And I think if you have someone who has, for example, chronic pain, like there might be benefit of having a macrodose, right? And dealing with some of the pain perception and the neuropsychiatric stuff. But also, if you do have a psychoplastogen that reliably reduces systemic inflammation or something, you had Chuck on the podcast recently, and, Chuck Nichols and his work on inflammation. And I know that's something you're interested in, Hannah. Is really exciting. And yeah, so I think, this actually alludes to a broader kind of issue, within the psychedelic space that we have at the moment, which is a lot of side taking and a lot of kind of backing ourselves into corners over mechanisms of action and, infighting, particularly maybe on the US side. I think there's a lot of big personalities in psychedelic research who are all kind of very fierce about, their mechanism of action being correct and everyone else is being naive. And I think, a bit of humility around, none of us really know what's going on here yet.
There's still so much to find out.
I definitely don't know. So.
But for the UK, we really must bring this in on the NHS, mustn't we? We don't want this to be private at all.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, Spravato is a good example, right? I think Spravato is technically covered in Scotland. I don't think there's much delivery, but down in England and Wales, NICE has just repeatedly denied it. And I almost, reading NICE's reviews of, Spravato, they're almost kind of annoyed by the kind of arrogance, I think, almost of Johnson & Johnson in saying we can repurpose the ECT suites, or, you could do this. And then, NICE are kind of saying, well, we have our own plans for the ECT suites. We have our own 5-year plan for integrating primary care and community care. And Spravato doesn't seem to fit in that. So I think it's also just, the drug sponsors, psychedelic drug sponsors also just need to start that engagement earlier where they can with NHS and just think about, how does this realistically look? And also just, come in with a bit of humility and be we see that the NHS is in crisis. How can we help? And how can we co-develop new physical spaces to deliver this rather than trying to pick away at, existing facilities? So yeah, I think it's going to be difficult, but, I agree, Joe, this has to be delivered on NHS, if at all, because, the average person with, PTSD or depression doesn't have the funds to do this. I mean,
no. That's actually how these companies will survive, is being able to have it scalable at the level of the NHS or at level of where it can be reimbursed in the States. Otherwise, there's not going to be the access that these drug companies need to be able to get their money back.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a key part of financial sustainability for companies as well. Yeah. But I mean, there is some hope. Like, I mean, Spravato had a difficult start, and I don't know, I don't have much of an opinion on like the efficacy of Spravato. I don't have like a, clinical opinion on it, obviously. But yeah, I mean, financially and like in terms of the sustainability of the product, like it's done a lot better recently. So it seems like, it took a couple of years, perhaps COVID had a role in that as well, but it took a couple of years to get payers on board and like logistically to get everything on board with the REMS program. And then it kind of took off. So I think, that's another interesting thing for psychedelics. How long will it take for all of these logistics to get in place, for reimbursers to get their head around it? And, when you think of MAPS, like they've admirably taken this anti-patent stance, right, where they haven't patented, well, at least Rick has, where they haven't patented MDMA. It would have been difficult to anyway. And they're relying on, 5 or 6 years data exclusivity in the US. But, it could take 5 years to get up to speed with, being able to provide this or longer. So I think you almost have this kind of almost tragic situation where all of the second movers, all of these for-profits that are kind of piggybacking on MAPS's work, might end up having this big second mover advantage where by the time they come to market in 2027, MAPS has educated the payers and, educated the providers, set up the networks of service delivery that then for-profit companies can come in and use and get up to speed with their delivery way quicker. So I think, that would be a shame. And, I think most people would, hope to see MAPS recoup their costs. But I think they're going to be doing a lot of this legwork.
So can we talk a little bit about the patenting issues? Because with a new chemical entity, it's really easy to see how those molecules can be patented. But patenting psilocybin, or as you were talking about with MDMA, unless it's a new molecule or product, it's very hard to see how that will work.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, on this topic, you should definitely have, someone like Matt Zorn or my friend Graham Pachenik on to talk about it in more detail, because it is a fascinating topic. And it's one of those things that we've been writing about a lot of Psychedelic Alpha. But unfortunately, like IP, intellectual property, is very boring and like very complicated. So it's hard to get into. But yeah, essentially, you can't obviously patent something that's known to nature, like a plant. So you can't patent, anything to do with psilocybin mushrooms naturally. There might be ways of patenting like genetically edited versions or biosynthetic routes to certain types of psilocybin products. But yeah, on the kind of synthetic drug development side, you can obviously patent a method of treatment. So using psilocybin, for example, to treat a certain disorder. And you can also patent certain synthetic forms, so obviously composition of matter patents. And that's, the main kind of, the strongest strategy that Compass would have, Compass Pathways, which is, patenting solid forms, so crystalline forms of psilocybin. There've obviously been issued patents on that, granted patents, and there have been challenges to those and they have been upheld. I think the controversy comes from the fact that obviously the whole point of a patent is, you're granting a time-limited monopoly to commercialize something in exchange for that public disclosure, right? So you have to teach a member of the public or someone who's skilled in the art that that your technology exists within, you have to teach them how to do this, enable it. So basically after that patent term expires, they could do it. The issue with psychedelics is, a lot of the things that we're seeing drug developers do today probably aren't innovative in the broad sense of the word. They're not necessarily novel in the kind of layman term, kind of layperson sense of the word, in the sense that, they're inspired by what originally indigenous people have done for thousands of years. And then more recently, all the mid-century exploration by, LSD therapists and researchers, and obviously much more recently, all the clinical research. So unfortunately, because of the quirks of how the patent system works, in the sense that it only searches for published literature that are in very specific places like academic journals or in a patent literature, when they go to search to see, has anyone ever made a DMT vape? Which obviously they have, right? If you Google it, you can buy them on the dark web. But if you search in, there isn't much in Elsevier about DMT. There isn't much, you know what I mean? So that's the issue. Things have been granted that probably aren't novel or innovative. The problem is once something's granted a patent, it's incredibly difficult to challenge it. It's very expensive. It could cost, $1 million just to kind of get a kind of post-grant review in the work. So you do rely on, deep-pocketed people who perhaps have their own commercial incentive to challenge a patent, whereas the public and, psychonauts and indigenous folks are kind of excluded from this whole process. I mean, so I think, that's where the controversies come from. But obviously, as you said, there are genuine ways that patents have been used, and they are obviously important to protect investment in research and development. But yeah, it's a fine line at that point. And we actually just published something last week about one company in particular who seems to have tried to patent a lot of work that other companies had already started doing. So yeah, that was a very interesting case. So yeah.
I mean, Josh, do you want to tell us a bit about that case? That seemed to be fascinating to me. Is that legal? I guess it is.
Yeah, so I think that company involved would, argue that what they're doing is they're finding different salt forms of drug products that might be more viable in the drug development pathway. They're producing data on those salt forms that would enable them to be used in future as like a clinical candidate. So, that's what they would argue. They would say they're saving time and money by producing this data, and then someone could license it for them. But a lot of other people, have expressed to us that, this seems like they're basically keeping an eye very closely on what other companies are publishing, in terms of their lead candidates, and then basically taking these very broad initial patent filings, provisional filings, and then as soon as they kind of see what other companies are working on, they kind of hone it in, produce data on a salt of the lead compound or a prodrug of the company's lead compound, and basically file on that. So I think a lot of people have looked at it and have emailed us to express concern about these types of strategies. And they're very common, in the bigger kind of pharmaceutical space, and at their worst, they're described as, patent trolls, people who file on things that they have no real intent to develop and then extract rents from them in the form of licenses from companies that do want to develop them. I mean, in the case of this particular company, in our piece, we didn't make any value judgment about their strategy, but it is an interesting case, and it's probably worth reading, especially in the sense that some of the things that they filed on were entirely novel psychedelics. So, for example, Delix Therapeutics tabananthalog and their AAZ compound, which, they designed and characterized and engineered at UC Davis. So it's not really feasible that you would just stumble across it. So yeah, it's an interesting case for sure. But yeah.
So definitely a space to watch then and see how that develops. And it kind of leads on to thinking then really about sustainability and the sustainability of these type of patents being filed, and how, the considerations that we need to think of these in terms of research, how they might hinder research and development. I don't know, Josh, if you've had any kind of insights into what these could really do.
Yeah, I think obviously, even just psychologically as a researcher, I mean, you two would probably know more than me, but as a researcher, if you start working with a compound and then someone informs you that, oh, by the way, that, that is protected by our patent, that might change your incentives to research it. Also, I think, there's, the patent system, especially in the US, is, just one of these broader kind of regulatory contexts that psychedelic drug development is happening within. There's other big policy systems and kind of conventions that might have similarly, important implications for psychedelic research, like bifurcated scheduling, which is the situation where, for example, when MDMA gets rescheduled in the US, if it's approved, it almost certainly won't be MDMA that you and I know and love. It will be an MDMA drug product that will have, probably a name associated with it. And in the same way, Compass Pathways will not be having psilocybin approved in the US. It will likely be Comp 360. So I think, even, and obviously, those underlying drug products might have patents attached, but even if they don't, just this fact that only drug products might be rescheduled has huge implications for research, because it doesn't make it any easier to research psilocybin or MDMA. It just makes it easier to research that drug product.
So that's a disaster. Well, it certainly doesn't help researchers like us, does it, Hannah?
No, I mean, that just in fact adds more complication. Could you imagine trying to explain that to the Home Office, that you need to do research on psychedelics which are under Schedule 1, but you can only access these drugs which are currently marketed? It would be an absolute nightmare.
So is there any way around that?
So actually, yeah, I think, again, Matt Zorn and Shane Pennington have a fantastic newsletter called On Drugs. So it's On Drugs and it's on Substack. And they write about these things, these things that have almost become convention, particularly in the US, and, have been exported to other parts of the world. But yeah, bifurcated scheduling, which is what it's called, it isn't necessarily, from what I understand, it isn't a kind of given based on the statute. It's just become a convention. So in the case of GHB, sodium oxybate, which was approved as Xyrem for narcolepsy, GHB remains, I think, Schedule 1. Whereas Xyrem is maybe Schedule 3, 4, 5, I'm not sure. And in the UK, obviously, you have the example of, is it Sativex, I think, which has THC and CBD in it, I think, but it's Schedule maybe 3 or 4 or 5, I'm not sure. But it's down scheduled, whereas obviously cannabis and THC-containing products remain higher scheduled. So, there's lots of precedent, both in, well, not lots, but there is a few precedents in the US and UK, to the point where we should probably, expect that it's going to be the same here. And, the practical implications of that are obviously most widely felt on the public, who are going to, remain criminalized by using something that's approved for therapeutic use. But also on the research side, it does deepen that kind of monopoly, that time-limited monopoly around the sponsor, right? Because as a researcher, it will likely, be much easier to do an investigator-initiated trial for that sponsor than it will be trying to procure the Schedule 1 substance yourself. So I think what we can do is, we can, again, campaign, whether you want to call it lobbying, advocate for reform around how things are rescheduled when drug products that contain the active ingredient are brought to market. Surely there should be some evidence-based rescheduling there.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Raises a really important point. I think, if you have these drugstores, the differences in types of clinical trials you'd have to do for an investigation medicinal product or Schedule 1 drug versus these authorized ones would be huge. And if you have a monopoly on the types of products used in the clinical trials, I think that would be a massive hindrance for research. So you kind of touched briefly on decrim, and it's lots of exciting change at the moment in terms of decriminalisation at the state level. I wonder if you could give us a bit of an update on the kind of current state of decriminalisation.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll focus on the US because it's probably the most interesting area at the moment in terms of the pace, speed. So I think in the US, you've had, local decriminalisation in places like Denver and Oakland for, half a decade now. But at the state level, it's only really heated up in the last few years. So obviously in Oregon, you have the first kind of regulated psilocybin system in the US where people can legally, as of a couple of months ago, actually legally get psilocybin services, which are explicitly non-medical, but, and they're not psilocybin therapy, but the protocols do look very similar. So, they're a lot more lightweight, but it does look very similar to, medically facilitated psilocybin. So that's in Oregon. And at the same time as that, they decriminalized possession. So it's all personal possession and use, and in some cases, cultivation. But under decriminalization, any kind of commercial activity remains illegal generally. And, sometimes what we call decriminalization is actually just making something the lowest law enforcement priority, which basically means if you're jaywalking in the US, so you're crossing the road whilst the man is red, if you're jaywalking and also, scoffing some magic mushrooms, the policeman should technically, or the cop in the US should technically do you for jaywalking, not for scoffing down magic mushrooms. So that's basically what it means. It's like an effective decriminalization. So that's in Oregon. And then, next year we're going to have Colorado doing something very similar to Oregon, having facilitated psilocybin services. And then down the line, they'll consider other psychedelics like ibogaine, DMT, etc. And again, they have this concomitant decriminalization of psychedelic use. So I think, in terms of the biggest misconceptions, I think one is that decriminalization permits, commercial activity, which it doesn't. So that remains very criminalized. And also, I think the other misconception is that these legalized models that we've seen at the moment are more accessible. Unfortunately, because of the way the licensing fees work in Oregon, for example, it still remains very expensive. So you're looking at around $3,500, which I think is £2,800 maybe, to have one psilocybin session. And, the average American, I think, has less than $3,000 in savings at any given time. So, it's still incredibly inaccessible. So this is, hopefully in time, Colorado looks like it will be a bit more liberal in terms of where psilocybin services can take place, or natural medicine services, as they're called, can take place. But yeah, at the moment, it remains something that's very much in the remit of, the wealthy, kind of almost elite. Yeah. So it's not that much more accessible.
Yeah, it's very, very sad and worrying. So Josh, what about Australia? I know lots of our listeners will want to know what's going on there and how this is how it's looking financially, really.
Yeah, I mean, luckily for you two, you have, David in drug science. So I think he'll know more about this than I'll forget. But yeah, I think I was very surprised. I think a lot of us that weren't that plugged in with what was happening on the ground were surprised with the rescheduling decision. I think the biggest, concern is that it's kind of rescheduling a medicine and kind of providing a way for it to be delivered in the medical model in lieu of any reimbursement, right? So I'm hopeful that some nonprofit groups, there's some already, will, come into that void and provide some, funding for people to have these sessions. But I think, I can't imagine it being a big care delivery model until there's reimbursement from insurers. I think I heard that there was one insurer that was thinking of doing kind of a real world trial almost to see whether it was cost effective. But yeah, I mean, what do you two think? Do you think it's going to be big, or do you think they need to wait until there's an approved drug and reimbursement until it becomes a big option for patients?
We're sort of waiting to see what happens. I really don't know, but having talked to a few Australians, that the worry is about the reimbursement and that it is going to be very expensive, as you just talked about in some states.
And I think it's critical that there's real world evidence collected right from the start. I think we need to have evidence collecting right away to try and get reimbursement. If there's the evidence there, then hopefully that can try and persuade the payers.
Yeah, and there's actually exciting stuff going on in Australia in the ketamine space. So the George Institute just published, researchers from, I think it's the George Institute, maybe I got the name wrong, who just published a few weeks ago a comparison of, bog standard racemic ketamine versus Spravato, which is a really exciting trial that drug developer would never do, right? Because they don't want to prove that they're inferior potentially or, equivalent to a standard generic product. But yeah, basically they compared generic ketamine to Spravato, and it was an early study, but it showed some sort of equivalence, right, Hannah?
Yeah, and so this opens up the question as well. Do you think more people might do that with psilocybin to show these kind of bioequivalent studies? It does raise that question once the patents run out, or if there's some type of space to be able to work within the realms of that patent, could you just have all these bioequivalent studies coming left, right and centre for drugs which essentially produce the same effect?
I mean, not if the pharmaceutical lobby has anything to say about it. I mean, so this is again, and I mean, we're getting all the bigger policy points that we need to really advocate for. And actually, Shayla Love, who's a fantastic journalist and friend, she has written extensively about how outside of the conventional model of developing drugs that are patented, and you have this time limited monopoly. There's many other ways, if we think more broadly, that we could prove that drugs are safe. And one of those is these kind of pharmacoeconomovigilance or whatever they're called, or pharmacoeconomic trials or something, where basically someone who has an incentive to reduce the cost of care, like a government, like the NHS, they sponsor these trials, and they basically say, well, look, we don't want to pay $800 per nasal spray for Spravato, so let's see if ketamine could even get us to 70% of the efficacy, in which case it might cost us $20 million to do the £20 million to do this trial. But, we, the NHS, and the public, at the end of the day, the payer, are going to benefit from the reduced costs. So I think it is just this broader thinking about the role of, government and having an ambitious government role in funding research. And, I was against Brexit, staunchly, but, after the fact, there was some hope that maybe we'd have this kind of post-Brexit spurt towards being innovative and world leading on the biotech front. But, now it's, I don't know, you two would know more than me, but it seems like we're just quickly becoming a rubber stamping authority that kind of rubber stamps other countries' innovation. I mean,
absolutely.
I would love to see the UK government funding some of this trials, basically.
Josh, it's really frustrating because we have so much world-leading expertise in psychedelics in this country. We have a life sciences sector deal where government are reinvigorating life sciences. It seems to me that to be, a no-brainer that those come together. And we have some government support for this research in terms of enabling research, which I know Home Office are starting to do. But financially, there have been, I think, only one charity or, Research Council UK funded trial into psychedelics. And that just seems like such a way, we're really missing out on a really important, could be so important for the UK.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's very frustrating for me that I travel every 2 months to the US, right, to work with companies and research groups there and like try and incubate new projects. And actually recently have been, speaking to some government agencies in the US about, grant funding and helping connect them with grants in, particular areas of research, and also, harm reduction. And, there's quite a proactive approach among some of the US state agencies and, National Institutes of Health in terms of funding this, but also, preparing for the inevitable adverse events that are going to happen among the public. So I don't know, it just seems way more proactive. And then in the UK, we're a much smaller country, I can walk to Westminster from my flat and I don't hear anything, it's like, so I don't know, maybe that's just a different system of government. But to me, it just seems a bit disappointing for me that I haven't been as involved. I've been more involved in the US than in the UK, despite the fact that I live in London and have lived here.
That's ridiculous, Josh. It's such a wasted opportunity. And you're producing this fantastic resource for all of us and not being supported. And then the research isn't being supported and we don't feel, but anyway, yeah, we could go on.
You're right, Joe. There is lots to be positive about in the UK. There's great researchers. I also think, ECNP in Nice, European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, that meeting that they did was fantastic. Like, in my opinion, I somehow managed to, wear a straitjacket and a fedora and sneak in there, like as a non-scientist. But it was pretty, a trench coat, not a straitjacket. But it was pretty incredible. To see all of these researchers who were, experts primarily and advocates primarily for their individual field of research, right? Whether it was pharmacology or, clinical psychology or psychiatry, as opposed to what can often be seen with our US colleagues, where somehow, a lot of the psychedelic researchers are psychonauts themselves or, big psychedelic advocates. So I think, in Europe and the UK, we have this advantage where a lot of the researchers are in it because of, and I know, Joe, I remember, your personal story of how, you became excited about psychedelics. You weren't some big psychonaut, right? You saw the data and you were like, this is so compelling, I have to get involved. And I think that's something that's really like special and kind of level-headed about us Brits. So
yeah, actually, in that context, we had the British Association for Psychopharmacology meeting last week, and we had a packed out, Josh and Hannah, session on the clinical application of psychedelics, and the year before the preclinical application. So what's just brilliant for me is seeing the people so experienced in drug development, people who've worked for J&J, worked for Big Pharma, worked for biotechs, have got 30 years experience in this field, coming in to work for pharma companies, developing psychedelics, and all the academics. And it is really about seeing the data, understanding how, significant and important the results are, and how badly needed that we need a different approach to mental health, to neurology for so many patients who just don't respond. So yeah, there's so much positive.
For sure. Yeah. And I think it's important for me to regularly remind myself of that because I spend so much of my time trying to predict what the challenges are going to be, what could go wrong, what are the difficulties in psychedelic research programs. So yeah, it is important to remember, there's a reason why we all spend our days, working on this because we're excited about it. So yeah, it's exciting.
I like that optimism. And so an optimistic prediction then, rather than a pessimistic one, what would you say, Josh?
An optimistic prediction in the next couple of years. Well, I'm really optimistic about MAPS' second phase 3 results. Every indication we have is that they're confirmatory, statistically significant. So I'm hoping we're going to see similarly amazing data as in the first phase 3. And also the second phase 3 is in a milder population. So people who don't have as severe PTSD, which will be, I think, really interesting and like a really good hint at how broadly applicable it will be.
And I think it's a more diverse population as well. That was something that was required, which is fantastic. And again, something that should be pushed for is more diversity in clinical trials. So that will be good to see in the results as well, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm excited about that. I am also excited about these non-hallucinogenic psychedelics because I think, from like a basic like nerdy and like, furthering and also, this idea that, Chuck Nichols, explains well that, basically we have this whole potential toolbox of molecules that have been overlooked because of prohibition. And, now, labs like those of the Nicholses are able to now revisit them and think, what might we have missed here that, helps with inflammation or helps with ocular degeneration or whatever. So I think that's just very exciting from like a pure, like, clinical possibilities point of view. And I think, we're going to start seeing some of that, early trial data from companies like Delix soon. The most fundamental question is, are these drugs that appear non-hallucinogenic in rats, are they non-hallucinogenic in humans?
Yeah.
Published something the other week about these people in these online forums who have got hold of, they got hold of tavananthalog and they've taken them and they've had decidedly psychedelic experiences. So whether it was a dose issue or whether it even was tavananthalog is to be determined. But so I think, there'll be interesting questions there. But then, whether they're efficacious, right? Like if we see these molecules, it could be a new class of, psychiatric medicine. So I think, that's interesting as well. And then just, following these really exciting trial designs from, groups like Boris Heifetz at Stanford and University of Wisconsin. They have the one where they co-administer psilocybin with midazolam to prevent the memory being formed, to try and understand whether, the subjective experience is necessary, whether the memory of it is necessary. And Boris Heifetz, obviously, his group did that study where they gave people intraoperative ketamine, which I think is super interesting. And they found that there was, no noticeable distinction from placebo, which again suggests that there's some expectancy effect with ketamine, or there needs to be the subjective experience. So I think
exactly.
So I think as a non-scientist, I think all of these kind of clinical trial designs that are trying to get at bigger questions, and these are the sorts of ones that often do need to be funded by philanthropy or, NIH or whatever in the US, because there isn't a clear drug development outcome for that. There isn't a clear commercializable opportunity, but it could have huge implications, not just for psychedelics, but beyond. And just lastly, Nora Volkov and I think Josh Gordon from NIDA and NIMH, they just published this opinion piece on, psychedelic research. There was some pessimism and, trying to temper the hype, but it was broadly optimistic. And at the end, they said, the big promise of psychedelics is not just that, of psychedelic research is not just that we might find, new treatments for mental health issues. It's also that, we might learn more about the very nature of mental health issues, right? Which could lead to, other interventions. And that reminds me of, obviously what Stan Groff said, which is, the psychedelics could be for psychiatry what I think it was the microscope was to biology. Something to that effect. And I thought it was funny that Volkov and Gordon were almost echoing Groff. But I think this is true, right? And you two know as researchers, we could learn a lot, right, about the brain and mental health. So,
brain, mental health, consciousness, and then also beyond neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, even angiogenesis potentially, behavioral changes, so much we can learn.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you hear people like Nora Volkov and Tom Insel, people who've got such a wealth of experience and have seen so many molecules come and go, when you see them or hear them being so positive about psychedelics, that's eminently reassuring, really is. It's really important.
For sure. Yeah.
We haven't got a lot of time left, Josh. I just wanted to ask about the microdosing industry and what's happening there and where you see that going.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of interest in it because I think for me, it's kind of like, more evidence is needed. And I think, with things like macrodose psilocybin experiences or whatever, it's like, I don't think there's much compelling evidence that there's any real safety risks outside of, psychological safety. Like physiologically, it seems that infrequent doses of psilocybin are not going to have any major issue, right? Hopefully. But with microdoses, I think, the work of Kellen Thomas, the pharmacist, and Brian Roth has written some about this. But I think, there are, people who are smarter than me have some concerns about chronic 5-HT2B agonism and, valvular heart disease and thickening of the valve. So I think, as a layperson, I defer to them. And, until there is actual, clinical trial data on chronic dosing or regular dosing of, 2B agonists like psilocybin, I think I'm kind of very almost worried about it. And I would like to see, even outside of clinical data, some longitudinal data about people who do microdose and, their incidence of heart disease later on. So I think it's, that's, I think the main reason I don't talk about it much outside of analyzing stuff like Balazs Segeti's self-blinding trial, which is really interesting. And, outside of talking about these studies. I try not to talk about it because I don't want to be a scaremonger, but I also don't want to like advocate for it until there is some definitive answer on the safety. So yeah, I'm worried about it. I'm hoping that it doesn't bear out to be a big issue, but I think it is concerning. And then I also just think it's kind of annoying. I think everyone who I mention, every time I meet someone and, my girlfriend says, oh, ask my boyfriend what he does or whatever, and I explain that I write about psychedelics, they're always like, oh yeah, like microdosing. Oh yeah, my friend, you know what I mean? So I always spend 5 minutes explaining that it's not microdosing. So I think I also just personally get annoyed with that. So. I also just think there's a really funny potential situation, well, not funny, but interesting potential situation where, because FDA in their draft guidance were very concerned about 2B agonism and said that it needs to be tested for and everything. But I think you could have this funny situation where potentially the government or, DEA in the US or, FDA could say that you're only allowed to macrodose. You're only allowed to have a full dose. You're not allowed to have a
only 6 times or something. Yeah, but won't pharma be doing these safety tox studies and won't they be looking at the heart?
Yeah, if there's companies doing trials in microdosing, and there haven't been many so far. I think there's one down in Australia that Vince Polito's working with. I think it's called like Woke Pharmaceuticals or some name like that. And then there are some, I think there's another one in Canada, and then, maybe Gilgamesh were doing some low dose stuff as well. So there are companies that had planned trials, but as far as I'm aware, there isn't any, trial data on microdosing. All of the psychedelic trials that are published have been, very infrequent, 1, 2, or 3 doses of, a macrodose. There probably is some earlier stuff, but I don't think it's like controlled or like long-term follow-up. So, but yeah, I mean, if someone's going to commercialize it, then obviously they'll have to do all that. Right?
Yeah. And then we'll know.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully, like there isn't a safety risk, right? That would be tragic, but yeah, let's see.
So then, Josh, just think about wrapping up. If there's any kind of last thoughts or any predictions to finish on.
Well, predictions is always a fool's game.
Yeah.
I know people seem to think that you're able to see into the future. I know it's a question you're always asked.
No, I mean, my predictions would be similar to things I've said earlier, right? Like good phase 3 data from MAPS, which I think will bring back some excitement to the field, especially public interest. And at the moment on this kind of hype cycle, I think the public is still on their way up. Like there's increasing amounts of reports of, celebrities, obviously Prince Harry, which I don't think did much for the UK scene. No. But I think for the US, brought a lot of attention. So yeah, I think MAPS' phase 3 data, if it's good, will bring a huge amount of attention to the space. But I think on the kind of investment and funding side, I think, as I said, like we will need to wait to see, commercial success until that really comes roaring back. And then, I guess my bigger prediction is just that, on this drug policy reform side, that things continue to be very quick in the US in particular, but also controversial. There's a lot of kind of power struggles between grassroots movements in these different states. And then, these kind of out-of-state, more coordinated actors that are trying to kind of templatize what happened in Oregon and Colorado, which I think is probably a expedient way of doing it and a well-funded way of doing it. But obviously, there are people on the ground who have been doing harm reduction and campaigning for a long time that do feel kind of threatened by this influx of new money that's going towards drug policy reform. So I think, both on the drug development side and the medical side and in this kind of decrim and legalization side, there is going to be, a lot of tension in the next couple of years. I think, my bigger hope is that from the more political side is that all of this, works to kind of reframe drug use as a, healthcare issue as opposed to, or a healthcare topic, not even an issue, as opposed to a kind of criminal issue. And I do think, luckily we are hopefully starting to see the dominoes falling in terms of the war on drugs in the US. So, I hope to see psychedelic policy reform situate itself within broader policy reform because psychedelics are, very white still, right? They're very white middle-class drugs. So I hope to see other drugs, given the same treatment as psychedelics soon. So yeah. And then in terms of things, if I have the soapbox now, I think the other thing I would say is, all these things we're talking about in terms of potential policy solutions or, campaigning, I think, I would love for people to get in touch with me if they're listening and they have a good idea that, we could take to governments or regulators. It could be like a startup idea about, how to build some part of the infrastructure that's going to be needed to roll out psychedelic therapy. But it could also just be a policy idea, right? I'm all ears and would happily, work with groups like, the Drug Science Psychedelic Medicine Working Group, for example. But yeah, I think there is a need now for an influx of, new ideas and new ways of thinking about this that kind of match the psychedelic spirit, right, of doing things differently, thinking differently. So I think we need to apply that inventiveness and thinking outside the box to policy and advocacy and funding. And so, yeah, I think get in touch if you have any ideas.
How do people get in touch? I think you're right. I think lots of reformers have the just do it attitude, which is what you had with the Psychedelic Alpha website. So how can people get in touch with you? Where can they find you on Twitter?
Yeah, for sure. So the best way to get in touch is email, probably, because I'm not very good at checking my DMs, especially now that Twitter has gone all X or whatever it is. I'm trying to minimize use. But josh@psychedelicalpha.com is my email. And also, I think, if there's people listening that, already in an established career or early career and thinking about, moving into the psychedelic space, there is this big need as we move towards, proper formal medical model use of psychedelics. There is a need for, subject matter experts that aren't necessarily just, psychonauts and passionate, but do have deep domain expertise. So, we have a job board at jobs.psychedelicalpha.com, which I think we're one of the only, groups maintaining it. So do join that job board, sign up for alerts. And when you sign up, you can fill in your profile. So, even if there's nothing available at the moment, maybe in a month or a year or 2 years' time, there might be a real need for someone like you to make this successful, whether it's on the policy or on the kind of drug development side. So I think that would be my biggest push, get yourself in that talent network, and then hopefully together we can make it work. Yeah.
That's great, Josh, because there are quite a lot of people, I think, Hannah, looking to move into this field.
And coming in with much more kind of what they consider to be more of a basic skill set within a specific niche. And maybe they don't realise yet just how they can apply that within the psychedelic context. So I think that's a fantastic call out. We've got lots of people listening who are students, early career researchers, clinicians of all different sorts. So definitely worth checking out the job board.
My last piece of advice, and I actually need to heed my own advice more, is to go to in-person events, and especially drug science events. There's communities of people that are interested beyond psychedelics. So I think, listen to the podcast, go to the drug science events.
Thanks, Josh. And that's how we met. We met at an in-person event. The three of us met for the first time at an in-person event. And so it's nice to kind of bring it back together, bring it back online. And I know I completely agree. I really missed in-person events during COVID, and the past couple of years now, it has been fantastic just to get back out there. I think in-person interaction is crucial. Thank you so much, Josh. I'm so glad we managed to get you on the podcast, and then we got Joe on here as well for the episode. It's been so good to speak to you and to get your wealth of knowledge. And just a reminder to everyone to check out Psychedelic Alpha and just see what an amazing resource it is.
We will put a few of the things we talked about today into the show notes. We'll put the economic analysis, which has been published.
Yes.
And yes, do read Psychedelic Alpha, folks. It's such a wealth of information. It's absolutely brilliant.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.